brother Jeremy and I loved to go camping. We spent most of our childhoods, into our 20s, exploring forests, caves, coasts, state parks, and genuine wilderness. The last trip we took together was a week-long hike through some of northern Canada's wildest backcountry. The camping trip we took the autumn I turned 25 wasn't our first time in Canada, but it was our first attempt to challenge its backcountry. Jeremy and I loaded up his old Toyota with the bare minimum gear we would need, including an ATV and an all-terrain sled the craft could drag. Our original plan was to go in late summer, but life and work events delayed us until well beyond the end of the season. I wanted to postpone the adventure until the following spring, but Jeremy, always the daredevil, decided that the risk of early winter weather made the trip more exciting. It was really only a few weeks beyond the usual season, he argued, and early forecasts looked fine and warm for the entire week. I went along with him despite my misgivings. I always did, trusting that my big brother had the situation handled. I'll regret not putting up more of a fight for the rest of my life. We picked a small stretch of forest toward the tip of the Yukon territory. To call the country there beautiful doesn't convey a fraction of the awe Jeremy and I felt. Driving across narrow, unpaved mountain roads, surrounded on all sides by soaring peaks and plunging ravines. Massive fir and spruce trees jutted up from the bluffs, cloaking the range in waves of evergreen. Our route took us over a wide, cold lake, so reflective that clouds chased each other across its still surface. There were no proper towns within 100 miles of the area we'd chosen to hike. The closest smudge of civilization we could find was a 6-building cluster, which I called an outpost, and Jeremy labeled Fort Frontier. We stopped at the settlement's general store, which was its only store, to grab a few perishables and other supplies we hadn't brought with us. Afterward, we visited the Outpost Tavern, which also served as its diner, post office, barber shop, and library. Jeremy and I were the only customers. An older man stood behind the rough bar. He didn't look up from his crossword when we walked in. The walls were cluttered with packed shelves. The wooden floors creaked, and dusty sunlight fell in slants from windows with thick, uneven glass. Even though it was early afternoon, the sun was already sinking into the mountains on the horizon, covering the valley in long shadows. "I'm guessing you two aren't here to pick up your mail," the old bartender said, setting a pair of glasses on the bar. "What do you have?" "What do you got?" Jeremy asked as we took up 2 of the 4 stools. "Beer, whiskey, vodka, but not much. There might be a half bottle of tequila in the back, but it would be older than I am, so I wouldn't recommend it." "Tough to get supplies out here?" I asked. "Damn near impossible. Takes planes, trains, and automobiles. And even then, half the shit we need we can't get. Half the shit we get we don't need." He swept a wind-burned hand around the room, with its cluttered shelves. "Orders get screwed up all the time. Last month, instead of sending me snowshoes, I ended up with 24 tennis rackets. What the fuck am I gonna do with 24 tennis rackets when there isn't a tennis court for 1,000 miles? Turn them into snowshoes?" Jeremy suggested. "Hell, I'll give you a discount if you want to try that. But, just like the tequila, you wouldn't recommend it?" The old man's smile added another crease to his corrugated face. "Just so." "I'll have a beer," Jeremy said. "Anything domestic is fine." The bartender slid my brother's glass under the bar's single tap. "All we have in stock is my home brew." He slid the dark and foamy beer across the bar. "Doesn't get much more domestic than the shed out back. For you, young man?" I glanced at Jeremy's beer, which looked thick enough to plug a sinking boat, but otherwise fine. Yeah, I'll take the same. Thank you. We sat and shot the breeze with the old man for the better part of 2 hours. His name was Clive, and he'd been living in the area since Moses was in diapers, if you could believe his stories. I watched the sun sinking into the bar's dirty mirror, and did my best to nudge Jeremy into moving along. But he wasn't a guy easily nudged. Our parents called him a walking hurricane. Not so much because he was a disaster, more so because there was no earthly way to contain or divert him once he picked a path. It didn't help that Clive was regaling us with tales of the wilderness, of shock freezes and camps wiped out by avalanche, of grizzly attacks and hikers lost for decades, until their gnawed bones were discovered on some lonely mountainside after a thaw. After our 5th beers, with the afternoon sky heavy with the blue over orange of an October sunset, I stopped nudging and prepared to drag Jeremy out of the bar. Since he was 4 inches taller and 30 hard pounds heavier, I doubted I could drag him anywhere. But I knew that if we didn't pitch camp before nightfall, it would be miserable and dangerous trying to do so in the unfamiliar dark. "Days a-wastin', brother," I said, sliding off of my stool. Jeremy pushed his glass forward for a refill. "Plenty of daylight left. Sit down, have another. 2 more tops, and we'll get to rambling." "I really think we ought to look for a campsite," I said, putting my hand on his shoulder. Jeremy didn't move. He just turned to look at me with sleepy eyes and a little smile I recognized all too well. I yanked my hand away as if my brother's stool was occupied by a bonfire. "Didn't mean to rush you," I murmured, sitting back on my stool. Clive watched the failed attempt at extraction without comment, though I thought I noticed a sympathetic twitch of his eyebrows when Jeremy refused to move. "You boys are going camping in the valley?" Clive asked, placing my brother's 6th beer on the bar. "We are," Jeremy replied, sipping at the heavy foam. "We'll find somewhere sheltered and close for tonight. Then we're going to make our way toward the lake tomorrow morning. Might do some fishing, pet some bears, enjoy this fine weather." Clive grunted. "I wouldn't count on the weather staying friendly. My knee's been acting up all day." "You got a weather station in your kneecap?" Jeremy asked. "More or less. It always aches when snow's coming. Maybe not tonight or tomorrow, but soon enough." "A little early for snow," Jeremy said, but I could hear the faintest shade of doubt in his voice. "Either way, if you boys need somewhere to camp out for tonight, you're welcome to use the woodshed out back. It's not exactly the Ritz-Carlton, but there's a stove in there, and enough to burn that you'll stay warm." "You see?" Jeremy said, slapping me on the back a little harder than I would have liked. "Wander with an adventurous soul, and the universe shall provide." He upended his glass and drained his beer in one go. "Now let's have another round or two to celebrate." Clive refilled both our glasses and poured a beer for himself as well. He drank with us, swapping stories through the night. It was nearly midnight when we were all more than a little drunk, when Clive pulled out a map of the area and unfolded it across the bar. "You guys are planning on staying here near the lakeshore, right?" Clive pointed to a sheltered area in the heart of the valley. "Yeah, in that general area," I said. I liked Clive, and he seemed trustworthy, but I didn't know him, and I didn't love the idea of him having our exact location. "We'll set up camp here where the trees should give us a windbreak," Jeremy added, pointing out our exact location. Clive nodded. "Even though the weather's been good, there's going to be a decent amount of snow on the ground across the entire valley. It doesn't even melt all the way at the height of summer, because we're so high up and the surrounding mountains funnel in storms. At night, even this time of year, it gets colder than the last circle of hell. The kind of cold that can kill you if it catches you." "We're prepared," Jeremy replied, only slurring a little. "I'm sure you guys are. I'm not questioning your abilities or your experience. Things are just different in the valley. Uniquely dangerous. Snowstorms pour through the mountains like that beer goes between your teeth. The day can go from clear blue to snowblind in the course of an hour. There's no reception because of the mountains either. Even satellite phones struggle. Once you're in the valley, you might as well be on another planet if you need help. One or two folks go missing in the region almost every year. I shifted on my stool uneasily. Jeremy had chosen the area and researched it, but had neglected to mention any disappearances. We appreciate the heads up, Jeremy said, pushing his glass forward for a refill. But we're prepared. I'm sure you are, so I'll let it drop after telling you two more things. If the cold gets too vicious or some snow whips up, there's an emergency shelter here. Clive put a little red X on the map. It's not much. A small cabin and an outhouse that the local mountaineering club installed and maintains every summer. And there will be some essentials in there, like a stove and blankets. Maybe even a deck of cards in case you get snowed in. Thank you, I said, trying to memorize the location of the shelter in case the trip went sideways. Clive noticed my focus. I'll give you this copy of the map to take with you. I have plenty here. There's one more area I'd like to mark for you. He moved his pen to a section of forest that spilled into the valley from the north, and drew a black circle around the tip of the woods. I strongly recommend avoiding this part of the forest. If you need firewood or you want to hunt lynx or geese, stick to the western woods on the far side of the lake. Why? Jeremy asked, leaning forward. What's wrong with the north? I caught a glint in his eye I did not care for at all. Clive cleared his throat and hesitated a moment before answering. It's hard to explain in a way that will make sense to anyone who hasn't been there before. The short answer is, that part of the valley is dangerous. And the long answer? Jeremy asked. The long answer is that part of the valley is dangerous because of what you might run into in those woods. And I don't mean wolves or grizzlies or moose. They all avoid that part of the forest. Strange things happen under those trees. Stories about death that comes with the snow. If you find yourselves near those woods, be careful. Don't trust anything you see or hear. If you run into other campers, don't follow them anywhere. If you hear cries for help and you can't see what's making them, don't go looking. What if someone's hurt? I asked. Or lost? You said people go missing around there a lot. Clive shook his head. I've got some flares I can give you if you haven't brought your own. If you hear something calling for help, send up a flare. Wait to see if they come to you. What if they can't move? Jeremy asked. Then I would suggest you haul ass out of the valley until you can get reception and call mountain rescue. Nothing stays alive in those woods for very long. Nothing trying to get you to go in there is your friend. Jeremy took a long pull on his glass. No offense. That sounds like a heap of bullshit used to scare tourists. Jeremy, I said. Clive sighed. I understand how it sounds. And I know you're both grown men and will do whatever the fuck you want. You seem like good people. And I want to at least put the idea of being a little extra wary of that valley into your minds. Most days the area's safe enough. When it snows, though, well, just be careful. Keep your fires fed and stay close to them. Don't wander from that heat and that light. And if your instincts tell you something ain't right, believe them. Jeremy put a hand to his heart. We solemnly swear to be super safe. I will personally restrain my brother if he tries to save anyone. He finished his beer, which was at least his 10th of the night. Now, who wants to play a drinking game? I woke up to the sound of Jeremy being violently ill in the corner of the shed. Listening to my brother retching caused my own stomach to shiver before trying to crawl out of my throat. Jesus, Jeremy wheezed, spitting onto the hard-packed dirt that served as the shed's floor. I do think that old man has poisoned us. It's your idea to try the tequila, I reminded him, clenching my teeth against a second wave of nausea. Jeremy spat again, this time into the simmering wood stove. He sat down hard on the ground and began pulling on his boots. All right, little brother, days of wasting. Let's hit the road. Clive was nowhere to be found, but he had left us a small bag of extra supplies in the back of Jeremy's truck, including the map he'd marked for us. It was still early in the morning when we drove away from the outpost toward the valley. Sunrise was better than an hour behind us, but the light was still weak and violet at the edges. We were able to follow a gravel road from Clive's bar down to a weather station. That was the last scrap of civilization before coming up on the valley. After leaving the station, the road turned from gravel into dirt, then from a dirt road into a dirt trail, and finally from a dirt trail into a faint impression on the ground that you might charitably call a path. Jeremy's truck handled the terrain better than I expected. For the last hour or so before we got stuck, I almost convinced myself we'd be able to take the Toyota with us into the valley. Then, just as I was drifting off listening to Jeremy's worn-out Waylon Jennings 8-track, we hit a series of bumps and came to a hard stop. God damn this mud, Jeremy said when we got out to inspect the issue. God damn this mud, these buried goddamn rocks, and this son of a bitch half-assed trail. Shit. It's not even a trail. It's like somebody combed the grass back and then dug a bunch of pits just to fuck with us. I nodded along to my brother's rant, diplomatically neglecting to point out that he'd actually drifted off of the trail and was driving through an overgrown field when we got stuck. We made a go of trying to get the Toyota running again, but no combination of pushing, digging, or dragging with the ATV could shift the truck. After an hour, Jeremy waved for me to stop. The light's already starting to fade, he said. If we don't get moving soon, we'll have to hunker down here with the truck. And that's another day damn near wasted. Help me load up the four-wheeler and its sled. We'll ride down to the valley and set up camp. And then we can worry about getting Susie here unstuck on our way back out. I never knew you named your truck Susie. Jeremy gave me the same grin he'd flashed at the bar. And if you tell anyone, I'll have to kill you. I moved my mouth, and it almost looked like a smile. You're not worried about leaving the truck alone? Well, I'll lock it, but... Jeremy gestured to the mountainside around us. A massive, empty space, populated almost entirely by spruce trees, boulders, dwarf shrugs, and lichen. I have this hunch nobody's likely to come along to bother Susie. The slope heading down toward the valley was gentle and mostly clear, so we made good time on the 4x4, even dragging the sled with the bulk of our gear. As always, Jeremy drove while I got to sit behind him, balancing the need to hold on to him tight enough not to fall, against the equally dangerous prospect of holding on to him too tight and pissing him off. While my ride wasn't ideal, I had no complaints about the view. A strong breeze shook leaves from the white and black spruce, poplars, and the trembling aspen trees that huddled in clusters across the mountainside. Their branches clutched tightly onto the last of their autumn foliage, making the hills around us burn with 100 shades of orange, yellow, and red. It was like driving into a frozen wildfire, broken only here and there by the green needles of sentinel pines and Rocky Mountain fir. The sky above us was bluer than B.B. King after his first heartbreak, with hardly a cloud in sight. Jeremy wasn't in the mood for conversation. Whenever I asked a question or made a comment about the scenery, I received a grunt in reply. Instead of pressing the issue, I did my best to relax and watch the wildlife. Grouse flitted from branch to branch in the trees around us. I noticed a pair of red foxes darting around the rocks on a nearby cliff. There were no signs of larger animals, but I figured the bears and moose were either hunkered down for the winter or wandering the dense patches of forest in the lowlands. It was midday when we found the mouth of the valley. There was no possible way to miss it. Behind us, we left a mountain at the peak of autumn, with short, bright days and small signs of life in abundance. But the valley appeared to already be covered by winter's shadow. There was snow on the ground. Not just a dusting, but drifts 4 or 5 inches deep at least. The trees in the valley showed no fall covers. They were bone bare and wind bent. The sun was already threatening the horizon where we were traveling. Looking up from the valley, only the faintest golden glow could be seen crowning the Cordillera. It's like fucking Narnia, Jeremy muttered, the first words he'd spoken since we left his truck. Looks like we have maybe an hour before it's night dark down here, I guessed. Probably less. Damn, it's cold. You think the ATV will be alright on the snow? Yeah, it's not too deep. Looks hard-packed. Should be alright. Let's find a good spot and set up camp for the night. It took us 20 minutes to find a suitable area on the edge of a small creek. There were enough trees to keep most of the wind off of us, and elevated ground where the snow was thin. But our camp was still miserably cold. We found plenty of fuel for our fire among the nearby pines, but the wood was wet and burned weakly, throwing out thick, white smoke. It was full dark before I finally got the fire stoked well enough to melt and boil water. While I worked on the fire, Jeremy set up our tent and ran into his own struggles with the wind, which nearly ripped the shelter from its pegs more than once. "I'm about 3 seconds from setting myself on fire," Jeremy grumbled, placing his shivering hands so close to the flames I wasn't sure he was joking. We ate a sad dinner of half-frozen, half-burned steak, then both went to bed, desperate to warm up. Even with hot water bottles slipped into our sleeping bags, and wearing all of the layers we could safely overnight in, neither Jeremy or I got much sleep. We'd packed expecting fall conditions, so our gear wasn't rated for the temperatures we were dealing with, though we had at least erred on the side of dealing with some winter weather. I went in and out of consciousness, often woken up by my own shivering or the sound of Jeremy's teeth chattering. The two of us took turns putting back on our coats and crawling out of the flimsy protection of the tent to stoke the fire and reheat the water bottles. Dawn broke cold and shadowed across the valley, and found Jeremy and I both already awake and utterly exhausted. All night I'd clung to the hope that the day might bring fairer weather, with enough light for us to gather up drier timber, the kind that could fuel a bonfire. Instead, the morning stayed nearly as cold as the night before. Low, fast clouds began slipping in through the mountain gaps not long after sunrise, smothering the daylight. Still, we made a dogged effort to follow the creek toward a nearby grove of spruce that we believed might have better firewood. "Oh, fuck," Jeremy said not long after we broke the tree line. A dead moose lay in the middle of the creek, a quarter-mile upstream from our camp. Something had raked its stomach open, leaving purple ropes of intestines and offal spilling out into the frozen water. "Should be alright," I said. "There's no flow to carry any of that downstream." Jeremy paced around the carcass. "Sure, but do you know how long the moose has been here? Or how long the water's been frozen? And is it completely frozen, or is there still some movement at the bottom? It's possible we drank some of this. At least we boiled everything," I said. But my stomach still twisted at the thought of drinking contaminated water. "We should move camp upstream just to be safe. Jeremy trailed off and turned his face upward. I understood why a moment later, when a snowflake landed on my shoulder. Thick, gray clouds had crept in while Jeremy and I were hiking. Snow began to drift down slowly. Not much of it, but more than I wanted to see. My brother held out his tongue and caught a flake. He spat it into the frozen creek. Fucking Narnia. By the time we trekked back to camp, it was snowing hard enough to begin to affect visibility. Our weak fire was holding on for dear life, as the snow and a rising wind worked together to strangle it. We need to break camp, get to that shelter Clive mentioned, Jeremy said, surprising me. I assumed he'd want to tough it out in our tent, even if we ended up buried. The nervous glances he kept shooting at the darkening clouds made me realize that he sensed a real storm coming. It took us less than half an hour to get everything loaded onto the sled. Then it was another hour trip by ATV to reach the cabin near the center of the valley. Snow was falling in a whipping haze by the time we reached the small emergency shelter. It was painted red, as was the narrow outhouse next to it. Neither structures looked particularly comfortable, but they both at least seemed well maintained. Jeremy parked the four-wheeler between the two buildings and covered it with a tarp, while I dragged our sled full of supplies into the cabin. The shelter was one main room with a loft above for sleeping. There were a few chairs, a small table, storage areas with tools, blankets, entertainment, and other essentials. And, best of all, a wood stove with fuel. A small sign asked that anyone using the stove bring in new firewood when departing, so that there would always be some available for emergencies. God bless the Alaskan mountaineering clubs, I said. By the time Jeremy stomped the snow from his boots and joined me inside, I had the stove burning. He smiled when he saw the fire. Thanks, Clive, Jeremy said. You might have just saved our asses. We used the remaining daylight to inventory the supplies in the shelter while storing what we brought along. I gathered snow to melt, then boil for drinking water, while Jeremy worked on making us dinner. By the time night fell, the cabin was cozy and warm. Our bellies were full, and we had time to sit and look out the windows at the blizzard hammering the valley. The wind howled, driving the curtain of snow sideways and causing the shelter to creak whenever a strong gust came through. It was tough to gauge, but I put the snowfall around 1 or 2 inches per hour, maybe more. We'd be buried if we were still in that tent, Jeremy said, shuffling the deck of cards for another game of hearts. I raised my bottle of beer. Here's to Clive and the... I stopped speaking when Jeremy suddenly held up a hand, signaling me to be quiet. He had his head tilted, listening intently for something. I did the same, but all I heard was the ever-present moaning wind. There, Jeremy said after a moment. Did you hear that? I got ready to shake my head, but then I did hear it. Barely audible over the wind and the crackle of the fire was what sounded like someone shouting. Jeremy bolted up, with me 2 steps behind him. He opened the door, letting in a blast of freezing air and snow. The sound repeated, clearer now, and unmistakably intentional. Someone was screaming for help. Can you tell where it's coming from? Jeremy asked, shrugging on his coat. Jeremy? He looked up at me, but continued tugging on his boots. What? Remember what Clive told us? I asked. About not chasing after any strange stuff we hear or see around here? He was just trying to scare us, my brother replied. But he did look a little hesitant as he pulled on his other boot. Besides, he told us to be careful of the northern woods. We're still pretty far from there. I always had a better memory for maps than Jeremy did. We were far out at the old camp, but this cabin's only a quarter mile from the tip of the forest. Somebody needs help, Jeremy said, his face set in a way that didn't welcome disagreement. You want to leave them in a blizzard because a crazy local guy got carried away telling stories? I heard the shouting again. It was faint, carried by the wind, which I realized by the snowfall was blowing down from the north. We've got Clive's flare gun, I pointed out. Let's send up a signal first and see if they come to us. Hell, if we go out with visibility this bad, there's a good chance we all wind up lost and frostbit to the bone. Jeremy glanced at the window, confirming that snow was coming down in solid sheets now. Fine, he grunted. Give me the gun. The flare burst open high above the cabin, like a tiny orange sun. It washed the valley around us in a bright bronze glow that was swallowed by the storm much faster than I expected. I wasn't able to see anything other than the snow and the silhouette of the outhouse in that brief flash of light. Send up another one, I suggested. Maybe aim it to the north this time? We only have 2 left, Jeremy said, but he top-loaded another flare into the gun's stubby barrel and fired it toward the northern forest from where the crying seemed to be coming from. Another orange flash faded quickly. Jeremy and I stood together in the light spilling from the cabin's windows, shivering and listening. I don't hear it anymore, my brother said, staring into the darkness. Me either. Maybe the flare what? I shrugged. Maybe it scared off whatever was making the noise? Almost sounded human to me, Jeremy muttered. Almost, I agreed. We went back inside and played cards in silence for another hour before bed. The wailing didn't return that night, and I began to wonder if Clive gave us the flares for more than just signaling lost hikers. It stopped snowing at some point during the night, and we woke up to find the sky overcast but calm. More than a foot of snowfall blanketed the valley, with drifts well past our knees. Everything was fresh powder, clean but treacherous. Even walking out to use the outhouse felt like trudging through quicksand. Our original plan before arriving in the valley was to spend a few days hunting and ice fishing, while hiking to the far side of the canyon and back. But the delays caused by overnighting at the outpost, getting the truck stuck, and moving camp to the emergency cabin had thrown our schedule into chaos. Jeremy did a quick inventory of supplies while I cooked breakfast. We should collect some more firewood while the weather's slightly better than miserable, he told me while we ate. I don't like the look of the clouds. If we get snowed in for more than a few days, we're at risk of running out of fuel. Let's take the sled with us, stock up on as much dry timber as we can find. Jeremy and I put on our snowshoes and took turns pulling the empty sled. There were scattered thickets close to the cabin, but each cluster of trees we visited were snow-soaked and would not burn well. Let's head north, try the forest, Jeremy suggested. The canopy there should have provided a little coverage for the wood. I looked in the direction he was pointing. It was the same area where the crying last night seemed to come from. Jeremy, Relax. He cut me off. Look, it's daylight. Nothing came out of the crying last night. It's probably a fox anyway. Probably, I agreed, not believing that for a moment. But there are still some groves closer to the cabin we can check first. They're all going to be wet or new timber, and you know it. My brother handed me the improvised rope harness we were using to haul the sled without the ATV. If there are any goblins in the forest, I'll protect you. Unless you keep bitching. I forced a chuckle. Yeah, okay. Let's just be quick. It's freezing. Reaching the northern woods was easy enough, even dragging the empty sled. Our snowshoes kept us from sinking into the fresh powder, so we crunched along at a healthy clip, taking turns with the harness. It was a different story once we pressed into the forest, however. Treacherous roots hid just under the surface of the snow, snagging, catching, and tripping. While the trees were sparse enough around the perimeter, they soon narrowed into claustrophobic tunnels, as Jeremy and I traveled deeper into the woodland. We had to stop several times to wiggle the sled through tight gaps. Jeremy at least was right about the canopy, offering the underbrush some protection from the snow. The northern forest was mostly aspens and birch, but there were pockets of pines that stood together like evergreen towers, their branches sheltering the dead wood below. We brought an axe with us, as well as a handsaw. We stacked the driest and oldest looking timber onto the sled, then topped that pile with a few choice limbs sawn directly from a thicket of fir trees. It was early afternoon by the time we filled the sled. I suggested a few times that we start to head back, but Jeremy kept pushing to go just a little further. "I don't think we're going to be able to pile any more timber in," I said finally, gesturing at the small mountain we'd collected. "It's already going to be a woman was watching us from the top of a nearby hill. At least, I thought it was a woman. The wind was kicking up small cyclones of powder all around the forest, limiting my visibility. Dozens of sagging, snow-laden branches being between us didn't help either. The dark-haired figure stood alone next to a lightning-split alder tree. It was hard to be sure, but she seemed to be naked. "Jeremy?" I said quietly. Yeah, I know. Last one," he grunted, sawing through a small limb bristling with green needles. "Jeremy, look." He followed my pointing finger until he saw the woman on the hill. "What in the fresh hell?" Jeremy muttered, lowering the handsaw until it hung at his side. "Is she naked?" "I'm not even sure she is a she," I answered. The figure watching us seemed to be hunched over, but still appeared to be much larger than a woman or even a man should be. It was impossible to get a clear look given the distance and obstructions, but something about the watcher made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "We should get back to the cabin," I said, slipping on the sled's rope harness. "What if she needs help?" Jeremy asked, staring at the figure. "She might be lost. And it's fucking cold. What if she's got hypothermia? Paradoxical undressing and all that." "She doesn't look like she needs help," I said, trying to keep an eye on the stranger while shifting the sled to point back toward the cabin. I noticed that the woman was keeping to the deep shade provided by a tightly grown pack of evergreens. The day was cloudy, but enough sunlight leaked out to paint the forest in bright lanes dotted here and there with shadowed patches. "Hello?" Jeremy yelled out, tossing the saw into the sled so he could wave both of his arms. "You on the hill. Are you okay?" "Jeremy," I hissed. He ignored me and took a step closer. "Are you hurt? Are you lost? Do you need help?" The figure tilted its head. Even with the wind picking up, they clearly heard Jeremy, but they didn't respond or move any closer. In fact, when my brother took a few more steps toward the hill, the woman suddenly darted away, heading north, deeper into the woods. "Come on," Jeremy said, hiking toward the hill. "Are you serious? Jeremy! Jeremy!" Against my better judgment, I slipped off the harness and followed him. We climbed up the hill slowly, sliding now and then in the deeper drifts. By the time we both reached the hilltop, there was no sign of the woman anywhere in sight. Jeremy knelt next to the lightning-struck tree and looked for footprints. "Well, that's fucking weird," he said. I scanned the surrounding forest one more time before crouching next to Jeremy. He pointed out the trail that he'd found, and my breath caught in my throat. The tracks were clear, but they weren't footprints. They were hoof prints. Two parallel marks curved at one end and combined at the other. The tracks followed the path we'd seen the woman take, until they disappeared in dense brush 50 yards or so away from the hilltop. "Deer?" Jeremy guessed. "Maybe our friend was naked except for snowshoes." Snowshoes would still leave tracks, I pointed out. Jeremy shrugged, but I noticed his eyes darting around the nearby woods. We're good on timber, little brother. Let's head back. I couldn't shake the prickly feeling of being watched, even after we left the forest. The sensation followed me on the long trek back to the cabin, made longer by the now fully laden sled. Even with Jeremy and I taking turns, we were both soaked in sweat and exhausted by the time our shelter came into sight. The sun's steady collapse into the mountain range added to my discomfort. There was something strange about the valley. Even the short northern days seemed to fade faster than should have been possible. I watched the sunset drain like a yoke into jagged teeth behind the mountains, and it made me want to be anywhere else in the world. We should leave, I told Jeremy the moment we were back inside the cabin. For what? We just got here. I don't mean just leave the cabin. I mean we should hike out of the valley today. Now. Back to the outpost? He asked, smiling that fucking smile I hated. No. Maybe. At least let's get back to the truck. He shook his head. We wouldn't even make it to the footfalls before it got dark. And we passed midnight before we got to the truck. If we could even find it. What's got you so riled up, little brother? Jeremy began adding new wood to the stove while I fidgeted, staring out the window. What's got me riled up? I asked. The giant, naked lady with hooves is not enough? A couple things to address there. We're not sure if it was a woman or even a person. Certain animals can... Certain animals? I interrupted. What the fuck kind of animal resembles whatever the hell that was out there? Jeremy shrugged, a gesture I was starting to despise. It could be an elk seen in bad light at a weird angle. Or a bear with a skin condition. And the tracks? I asked. Another argument for the rogue elk theory. I gave up, collapsing into a camp chair and holding my hands out to the fire. We sat without speaking for a while, hearing nothing but the wind and the crackling logs. Every few minutes, I couldn't resist glancing out the window toward the forest. There was no sign of the figure from the hill, but I did get a perfect view of dusk taking the valley along with a stream of heavy clouds pouring in. Looks like more snow tonight, Jeremy remarked, looking out the cabin's other north-facing window. Yeah. Let's hunker down tonight. Plan on hiking out in the morning, he said, still staring through the glass. Oh, sure. It might have been my imagination, but I thought I heard the faintest touch of worry in my brother's voice. That unsettled me more than the encounter in the woods or the impending storm. I'd never known Jeremy to sound even a little anxious, nor could I remember him ever wanting to cut a trip short. Night fell quickly over the cabin. The clouds blocked any hint of stars or moonlight, so the valley around us seemed like an empty, never-ending black void. Snow began to fall not long after sunset. The wind snatched it up and lashed it against our shelter with an intensity that grew by the hour. Thank God for Clive, I said again, watching the chaos through the window. With the stove burning and our supper cooking on top, it was damn near cozy inside that little shack. Jeremy's reply was drowned out by the same wailing we'd heard the night before. Only this time, it was much closer to the cabin. We both stood up. I reached for the flare gun on the table while my brother lifted the axe from where it lay propped in the corner. It's that thing from the woods, I said, staring out the window, but unable to see anything other than darkness and snow. We don't know that, Jeremy said. It could be the wind. His hands, knuckles white from their grip on the axe, told me he didn't believe his own words. The wailing returned, even closer, now sounding like it was only a few feet away from the cabin's door. The sound changed from a keening howl to sobbing, I watched in horror as something rattled the doorknob. We'd locked it earlier, more out of habit than any expectation we might have to face intruders. Something began pounding on the door. I stood slack-jawed, pointing the flare gun at the entrance. Jeremy stepped closer to the door, raising the axe to the ready. "Who's there?" he shouted, struggling to make himself heard over the wind and the wailing. There was no answer other than continued banging at the door. "Who's out there?" Jeremy roared, and I knew he was scared because he was becoming so angry. "What the fuck do you want?" "Because you don't want to come in here, asshole. And you definitely don't want me to come out there." The knocking stopped. "Jeremy?" I said when he moved closer to the door. "Shh." He leaned against the wood and listened. Outside, the sobbing started to sound like laughter. "Motherfucker," Jeremy muttered, taking a step back. "Hey, shitbird," he shouted. "I don't know what you're laughing about. You're the one in a..." The laughter grew loud and frantic. I tried to get a look at whatever was near the door through the window, but I couldn't see a damn thing. "Fuck this," Jeremy muttered, reaching for the doorknob. "Are you nuts?" I whispered. "Whatever's out there, it doesn't seem like it could get inside, so let's just wait." "Mother... fucker," a voice growled from the other side of the door. "Ass... hole... shit... bird." Jeremy and I exchanged a look. The voice sounded human, but it was like it was coming through a wire with a gravel-stuffed tin can on the other end. A window shattered, a rock landing on the rug near the stove. "Fuck this," Jeremy said quietly, hoisting the axe and reaching for the doorknob. "Don't!" I shouted. But the door was already open, its hinges screaming as the wind or something else ripped it from Jeremy's hand. There was no one on the other side of the door. The snow began blowing in from the opening as Jeremy inched toward the blackness, axe held high. "Don't," I repeated, this time whispering. But my brother ignored me until he was standing in the narrow streak of light outside the doorway. After a moment, he looked over his shoulder and smiled. "See? If something wants to fuck with you, you just have to..." Long arms reached out from the night to wrap themselves around Jeremy. The skin on the arms was pale, leathery, and mottled. Smoke came off of the arms wherever they touched the light from the cabin, but they were only exposed for a heartbeat before dragging Jeremy off into the darkness. My brother didn't even have time to scream, but I saw his eyes go wide with panic before he disappeared. "Jeremy!" I shouted, staring out the cabin door. He screamed then, a terrible animal sound full of fear and fury. I ran after him without thinking about putting on my jacket or my boots. The only thing I had with me was the flare gun I still clutched in my bare hands. A few yards outside the shelter, it felt like being dropped into the Arctic. My feet, only covered by socks, were soaked and frozen within the first 3 steps. A hard wind stung my eyes and chilled my fingers, nearly drowning me in whipped snow. "Jeremy!" I yelled again, choking on the powder but still moving forward. I was chasing the last image I had of my brother, hoping that whatever took him was still moving in the same direction. There were drag marks in the snow, but they were fading by the moment. The drifts were so deep, and the wind was a gale, and the cold was draining me with every trudging step. If I went back to the cabin for my gear, I knew what little trail I had to follow would be gone. If I didn't, I knew I'd be dead from exposure in an hour. Maybe less. and close to dead long before that. Torn between going back and moving forward, I stopped. That's when Jeremy screamed again, and this time it was a panicked shriek. Desperate to see what was happening, I raised the flare gun at an angle and fired it toward and above the sound of Jeremy's howl. The flare burst overhead, washing our piece of the valley in a chemical orange light. It was snow smothered quickly, but in those brief, bright moments, I saw a scene that I'll revisit in nightmares for the rest of my life. The thing attacking Jeremy was huge, at least 9 feet tall, wearing a torn, ragged cloak or jacket. It screamed at the light, dropping lower to run across on 3 of its 4 limbs, dragging my brother with the 4th. Jeremy was fighting, swinging wildly with the axe, but unable to land a hit as he was yanked across the snow. The creature shook him as it ran, slamming Jeremy against the ground like a cat casually braining a mouse. When the flare was gone, stolen by the wind and buried in the powder, I tried to move, but the shock combined with the cold kept me anchored. Jeremy screamed one last time, his voice so distant that I knew I had no hope of catching up. "Jeremy," I repeated, softly this time. The wind snatched his name away in a breath of steam. I returned to the cabin for my gear, but I was numb, shivering so badly it took nearly an hour standing next to the stove before I could tie the laces of my boots. The broken window continued dumping snowfall inside, until I duct taped several blankets and a poncho across the opening. By the time I was able to restart my pursuit, the creature's trail was gone. After an hour wading through the storm with no luck, I returned to the cabin and swore I'd restart my search at dawn. Some small luck finally broke my way. Sunrise burned away the blizzard until it was only a perpetual dusting. Though Jeremy's trail was long blown away, I knew where I needed to look: the northern forest. Even with snowshoes and no sled to drag, it took me a good part of the morning to reach the woods due to all the new snowfall. I followed the path of sawn limbs that Jeremy and I had left the day before when we were gathering firewood. Once I reached the hill where we'd first seen the figure, I realized that I would never see my brother alive again. A large sheet of what I first took for leather was tangled in the branches of the lightning-split tree on top of the hill. When I got close, I saw that it wasn't leather. At least, not animal leather. The mantle was made from patches of human skin, all sewn together with thick stitches of sinew or tendon. I'd mistaken it for a jacket the night before, when I saw the creature wearing it. And I'd mistaken the creature for a person when we'd first encountered it at a distance while it was wrapped in the skins. I leaned against a nearby tree as my breakfast from the night before came up and landed steaming in the snow. The cloak was tanned and well preserved. I guessed it was several years old, though some of the patches of skin may have been newer. Shaking from much more than the cold, I explored the area around the hill for any sign of Jeremy. To this day, part of me wishes I hadn't. I found Jeremy's clothes half buried in snow on the other side of the hilltop. There was no sign of him or the creature, but there was a red stain under a nearby pine. The blood was fresh, at least as fresh as frozen blood can be, and there was so very much of it. It took me nearly 2 days to make it back to Clive and the outpost. Bad weather rolled in again, and Jeremy's truck was stuck deeper than I thought. but eventually I managed to report him missing. By the time the search party made it into the northern woods, the blood was buried or blown away, as were Jeremy's clothes. I'd kept the sheet of skin, and none of the searchers had an explanation for that. But neither did it help them find my brother. Jeremy is still considered missing now, even years after our trip. Though the general consensus is that he ran afoul of a grizzly. I've never stopped looking for him. I return to the valley every summer, to that small cabin where we spent our last days together. I've spent weeks hiking through the northern forest, but those woods go on for miles upon miles. They're peppered with caves and even old mines from the gold rush. If I had a dozen lifetimes, I'd still never be able to explore every acre of that cursed place. Twice, though, during nasty storms that turned the sky grayer than the long dead, I've seen a figure watching me from a distance. I've long wondered when it will decide that it's time for new leathers. When that night comes, I'll finally have it. Or it will have me. And things will be over. Either way.
Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/JordanGrupeHorror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.